Thank you guys so much for being here for the School of Energy Resources Distinguished Speaker Series. So go ahead and grab your seats, and I'm going to introduce our speaker, and we'll go ahead and get this show on the road. So welcome to the presentation by Harold Skip York. Dr. Harold York is a Senior Vice President and Chief Energy Strategist at Turner Mason & Company, an energy consulting and advisory firm focused on crude oil, refining, midstream, and biofuels industries. He's responsible for looking at strategic directions in the energy industry with specific expertise in global oil and gas asset portfolio optimization and developing viable business models for the new energy companies. That's a mouthful. Try working on it. Yeah, his most immediate prior role was as head of commodity strategy, petroleum for BHP. He has additional industry experience with ExxonMobil and management consulting with McKinsey & Company, Charles River Associates, and Wood Mackenzie. Skip holds a PhD in economics from the University of Virginia and an undergraduate degree in economics from the University of Wyoming. Yay. Thank you. He did postgraduate work at IIASA, which is the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna, Austria. So thank you all for being here today. Welcome, and I'm going to turn it over to our speaker.
Well, that's, there should be some joke there about, gosh, you're applauding before I even started. So let's hope that I earn it. In a real sense, since I've got sort of a broad swath of the university community here, I want to say that, and I think, heard it yet, is this working? Yes. Okay. And I think Holly, and I said this in a group that Holly was in yesterday, is I want to just take a moment to thank this university. I am where I am, and I've gone on the career path I went on because of this place. And this place will always have a special place in my heart. Not only with the education I got here as an undergraduate, but when I was applying to graduate schools, people in the Department of Economics made phone calls. And those phone calls resulted in me getting into the University of Virginia, which at that time was ranked 7th in the world in terms of graduate economic programs. If they hadn't gone that extra effort, I probably wouldn't be here today. I don't know where I would be, but it probably wouldn't be here, and it probably wouldn't be with the colorful stories that I could tell you when we get to the Q&A section. What I want to do is just tell you a bit about, worked with Cam, and I'm teaching a corporate strategy course in the College of Engineering, trying to help them, students, understand what corporate strategy is and how you think about it in the energy, how the context of the energy transition might change how you think about strategy or how you change your strategy. This is going to be a snippet of that class, and we're going to talk about the risk profiles of the transition. One of my concerns that I hear, and I think the discussion in the energy transition is maturing. It's becoming more adult. It's becoming more professional. It's becoming more collegial than it was, say, 4 years ago. We are not yet talking about risk. And what we are doing in the energy transition is we are trading one risk, which is we are worried about the carbon footprint of the world, and we are going to other energy sources. But those other energy sources and that transition have risk profiles. And we've got to be aware of what risk are we trying to mitigate and what risks are we taking on in order to do that mitigation. Here's the punchline. I don't have any answers. I'm going to raise more questions than I've got answers. But I will say, I will do one, and on the topic of questions, I will take questions on the fly, because if you have a question, I guarantee the person to the left or right of you has the same question. And what I don't want to do is get 3 charts down the line, I've lost you because we didn't clear something up 3 charts earlier. If it's coming up later, I will say, oh, by the way, I've got a slide, let's park that. And then it's incumbent on you to remind me to come back to it. The other thing I will say is for all the students that are here, is the last couple of classes, yesterday afternoon, this morning, the level of engagement's been ramping up in each class. So the engagement bar is pretty high, and you better be bringing your A game. If you want me to think that you're engaged, you better bring it and bring it all. and I'll also tell you for your students, if you have a question, so do the faculty members here. I guarantee you that if you have a question, there's some faculty member that has the same question. So don't be afraid to speak up or ask anything. Now, with that, am I on? Okay. Did I turn? There we go. Okay, we're working. So lesson number 1 for all students, never read a bullet point chart to an audience. Right? You can talk to it, but don't read every word to them, because you'll lose the audience. What this chart tells you is that we've entered an energy crisis in 2022 and 2023. I think this crisis is going to last another 3 to 4 years, because we've got just a number of energy markets that are out of balance. And energy are large capital investments, and it just takes time to make the investment decision, build the project, and get that production online. And so we are likely to see this crisis persist. So one of the things that we're seeing that's a bit unique about this crisis versus other historical crises that are on the chart is that most energy crises have been fairly localized. It's been like one commodity, and typically one commodity in one part of the world. Like the UK doesn't have enough coal for its power generation, okay? So it's an issue around coal, and it's an issue specifically in the UK. Makes it a bit easier for the rest of the world to get their arms around the problem and solve it, because we only have to solve that problem in one place. This crisis is different. This crisis is across all forms of energy, and it's impacting virtually the entire planet in some ways. Now, it's hard to believe that if you're sitting in the US, and I haven't looked at this morning's board, but yesterday, Henry Hub was trading at $2. It's hard to believe that we have an energy crisis, or we have a supply shortage of natural gas. We don't have it here in the US, but the rest of the world is in a natural gas crisis. And part of it is the mobility problem. It's hard to move natural gas unless it's connected to a pipeline, unless you do it by LNG. And LNG just can't be built overnight. So this issue is kind of spreading. That's why I think it's going to just take a long time, longer than usual amount of time. Does that mean that prices are going to stay elevated? No, I think what it really means is markets are tight. We're likely to see a lot of volatility, and a lot of shortages could emerge in certain parts of the world, and then they get alleviated, and then they pop up in some other part of the world. And with that, that's just an example. So I think 2020, this is the other thing I was going to say, is that the energy crisis that we're in right now actually was manifested 10 years ago. We made a series of decisions over the last 10 years across the energy space such that in 2022, we ended up with not enough surplus in the system to manage sudden changes in demand profiles. So this energy crisis wasn't caused by the demand surge for energy coming out of COVID. This energy crisis wasn't caused by the war in Ukraine that started a year ago, but they were the catalyst that brought the crisis to bear. But this crisis was going to happen one way or the other. It was just what we saw were two trigger events that triggered the crisis to emerge. When I was at BHP back in, I guess it would have been 2018 or 2019, we talked about a price fly-up in LNG that we thought was coming in 23 or 24 and likely was going to last until 28. And we got it. The reason why we got it wrong is because we didn't see the demand surge for LNG in Europe, which really started to pull LNG out of the rest of the world and into Europe. And we saw, LNG prices literally quintuple in the last 18 months. And they've backed off from where they were, but they're still, 2 or 3 times what LNG prices would be in a globally balanced market. So that's what I mean by this thing's going to persist. This chart is just an example. Just think about this really quickly of how timing matters in making these decisions. So this chart on the right, we're just going to talk about the left-hand side with the green. Suppose that there was one oil and gas company in the world, and it's us. And we are sitting in 2020. We've read the IEA's Pathway to Net Zero report. We read all 368 pages, by the way. We didn't just read the executive summary. We read every page. And we come to the conclusion, there's a part of that page, there's a page in there that says, if we're on the pathway to net zero, we don't need any greenfield oil or gas projects from this point forward. All we need to do is ride existing production into decline and do some brownfield expansions that are nearby tiebacks, and that will result in enough oil demand, enough oil supply while we're transitioning to 2050. Okay, and we believe it. We read the report and we say, okay, we think that's the way the world's going to work. And so in 2020, we decided to stop doing greenfield projects. And if we do that, we're on that green area that comes down. So that's going to be the natural decline that's going to happen with reinvestment. And if you look at it, when we get out to 2050, we're at about where the IEA says oil production needs to be in a net zero world. So we said, okay, that's the path we want to be on. We roll forward 5 years, and our economists come in and they say, well, okay, we're not on the green line. We're on one of those other lines. Pick the purple line or the blue line. Right now, we're on the blue line in reality. So we're on the blue line. That gray area is the supply-demand gap. And so, I'm the CEO because I came up with this example. So I'm the CEO and I go to the economist, hey, why are oil prices $150 a barrel? And they say, well, it's that gray bar. It's that gray area. We've got more demand than there is supply, and we just have to, we're rationing oil with price. And I said, well, gosh, I look at that blue line as the CEO of the only oil company in the world. I'm like, you know what? I don't think that's really a good solution for us or for our consumers. Hey, let's do some greenfield projects. So we will approve some greenfield projects. We're going to get them underway. And it takes us 5 to 7 years from the day we decide to do the project until first oil, right? That's the solid red line. So what's happened to the market while we were actively doing these greenfield projects to bring more supply to the market? What happened? Well, the existing base kept declining, and demand is kind of flattish. So the supply-demand gap is by the time we bring the oil to market, the supply-demand gap is actually bigger than when we realized we were in a crisis. That's why this crisis is going to persist, because it takes time to get those supply responses in place, but we can't say to the world, hey, I got an idea. Why don't you guys just stop consuming energy for 3 years? And then, that'll give us on the supply side. We'll get everything all worked out, and then we'll flip the switch back on. You guys can go back to consuming energy. Well, that's just not how the world's going to work. And this is a reason why. Why do we care about energy consumption in the world? We care about it because what we know through decades of economic development is that the most important or the biggest lever you can pull to move a population from poverty out of poverty is to solve energy poverty. There's a very high correlation between countries that are economically impoverished and countries that are energy impoverished. And so if you look at it, we have there is nobody that has a lot of poverty but consumes a lot of energy per capita. But we got a lot of people that are in poverty, and as they pull out of poverty, they tend to consume more energy, right? That's kind of what that dashed red line shows us. Now, once you solve your economic poverty, look at all those countries that are lined up on that vertical axis. Once you solve the economic poverty, you now have the ability to choose energy efficiency, sources of energy. You can now make all sorts of substitutions and efficiency decisions. And so we can see a smear of these countries that are along that vertical axis, but you don't have anybody, like Mozambique can't make any of those choices because Mozambique just doesn't have energy to start with. The average person there doesn't have access to energy at all. So it's a lot. So we'll kind of come forward into the next chart is about, when we talk about carbon emissions, let's be cognizant that there's a big chunk of the world that doesn't have a carbon footprint because they don't have an energy footprint. And we've got to keep that in mind as we're going through this transition. The one thing I will point out on this, to kind of put the energy transition in perspective. if we're going to try and get to net zero by 2050, we're going to be asking the world to take about 60 to 70% of today's energy sources, which is, oil and gas. And if we put coal in, we're close to 80% of world energy supply, and they're carbon emitting. And we're going to ask the world to not eliminate them, but dramatically reduce that 80% down to about 20% and replace it with low carbon energy sources. So we're going to ask 80% of the oil supply to go to peak supply and come off in the next 30 years. Now, in the history of humanity, there has only been one source of energy that has ever had peak supply and then diminished, and that's whale oil. Whale oil is the only source of energy known to humanity where supply has peaked and then diminished. We are burning more oil, gas, coal, nuclear, hydro, solar, wind, biomass, which is a polite way of saying manure, wood. Most people don't realize, we are burning more wood today than at any point in humanity. So we are now going to ask that energy complex to go through peak supply for 80% of it and drive it down in 30 years. So something that humanity's figured out how to do once in a couple of 100,000 years, we're going to ask the entire energy complex to do 3 times in 30 years. That doesn't say it can't be done, but that's the order of magnitude of the challenge. That's the size of the issue that we're going through. And oh, by the way, why did we stop consuming whale oil? Yeah, no, we didn't run out of whales. We found a substitute, and we actually found 2 substitutes. One substitute was oil, was petroleum oil. So Drake drills the well in Titusville, Pennsylvania. We discover oil. We figure out that if you boil it in a big wooden vat, it'll separate into different cuts. One of those cuts that comes out is kerosene. We started going from whale oil lamps to kerosene lamps. So easy substitution, right? We just pour the kerosene in, and same lamp, same wick, we just light it up. The second substitution that came along a little bit later was coal. Now, we were already burning coal for a variety to keep our houses warm, but we sort of figured out a way to industrialize that and scale it up, burn coal at a high enough temperature that we could boil water, spin a turbine, and produce electricity. So in a very real way, the oil industry saved the whales because it enabled us to substitute away from, by the way, in the 19th century, we knew we were hunting the whales to extinction. But we wanted lights in our living room more than we wanted whales in the ocean. And a substitute came along. Now, was Drake sitting there in Pennsylvania saying, if only I could figure out a way to substitute whale oil for something else? Well, I can't think of a way to substitute. I guess I'll go out and dig a water well, and then boom, he hits oil like the Beverly Hillbillies. No, he wasn't thinking about solving the whale oil problem. He was thinking about solving an energy problem. And by solving an energy shortage problem, or an energy problem, he ended up solving a whale problem. That's kind of how humanity works. And I kind of believe as we go through the next 30 years, that's how humanity is going to keep working. We're going to see largely people are going to be solving problems, a different problem, and it's going to help us someplace else. Now, here's the thing about where we talked about that energy poverty. Here's the other thing about if we eliminate economic poverty by eliminating energy poverty, one of the consequences of eliminating energy poverty is carbon emissions. So this goes back to that. Remember the people in Mozambique 2 charts ago? When you talk about reducing their carbon footprint, they're that little green bar. Their response is quite fairly, what carbon footprint? I don't have an energy footprint. How can I have a carbon footprint? And we've got to keep it in mind, and then you're going to see it later on about why, and all of the above is the transition pathway that we've got to be on. Because the all of the above solution. So first of all, as an economist, I've never seen a corner solution that was optimal. Am I right? Never happened. It's not, which is his way of saying, no, it's never happened. So, so corner solutions rarely are the optimal answer. And that's why I believe in the all of the above, because there's a lot more, when you think about it from an environmental standpoint, there's a lot more we need to solve than just carbon. And I think one of the advantages that COVID brought to this issue in particular is it paused the discussion and the debate. And I think it paused the debate, and I think we're now moving more towards a discussion around climate change and a discussion around energy transition, where I think in 2018 or 2019, we had a yelling contest around climate change and a yelling contest around the energy transition. And I think that what COVID did is that what it taught us is that it's not that 2050 doesn't matter, but the path from here to 2050 is a series of steps along the way. And if we can't take the step from 2021 to 2022, how in the world are we going to take the step from 2022 to 2050? I think that's the perspective that we're now having in the discussion. Still comes back to, it's still not the discussion I want. It's still not as holistic as I want it to be. So what are we concerned about? What's the risk around the energy transition? Well, we want to reduce carbon emissions, because here's what the IEA says. If we don't reduce the warming of the planet, here's some environmental impacts that might happen. And the only thing I want to point out here is that these are risks. We've got to not talk about risks as certainties, because risks have a probability and risks have an impact. And there's something different about if it's 100% certain, it's not a risk. It's an event, right? There's not a risk that there's going to be a basketball game tonight. It's an event. There's a 100% chance that Wyoming is going to play CSU in basketball tonight. There's not a risk. The risk is we may not win. There's a probability that we will win. And if we do win, there is some magnitude by which we will win, right? But we don't know what either one of those are. So we've got to be careful to not look at this page or any risk page and say, that's what's going to happen in 2100. No, it's a risk. It's a risk that it might happen. And if it does happen, it's what might be the impact. But what can we do between now and 2021? We can mitigate that risk. We could be doing things, and I don't want to say should. We can make choices that will do things that will mitigate as two things. Reduce the probability that a risk occurs and reduce the magnitude of the impact if it does occur. That's what mitigation does. Now the other thing is, notice what I just did is I just made the fatal flaw when we talk about risk. The fatal flaw is that we always talk about risk as if it's a bad thing. Risk is just something different than what we expected. We have an expected case, and the risk is that expected case doesn't happen, something else happens. So there are good risks just like there are bad risks. Should we be mitigating good risks? By all means, yes. Because when you're mitigating a good risk, what are you trying to do? I'm trying to increase the probability that that event occurs. And if that good event occurs, I'm trying to increase the impact of that good event. So we mitigate risk whether it's good or bad. But we're human beings. We tend to be risk averse, and so we tend to think that only bad things can happen. And those are the things we need to be worried about in the future. And we got to be part of a better risk profile, part of a better way of managing risk is to manage that risk holistically. What negative risks can we tolerate? What positive risks do we want to exacerbate? Do we want more of? Okay, so now we're going to try and mitigate this climate change risk. We're going to try and reduce CO2 emissions, because we looked at that last page and we said we want to reduce the probability that the planet warms that much, and we want to reduce the impact if it does. So one of the things we're going to do is the energy transition. Now, the energy transition is just a multisyllabic way of saying electricity. That's when you boil down the energy transition, pardon the pun, all you're talking about is electrifying the economy. We're going to try and take the economy from processes that use thermal energy, hydrocarbons, for their process today, and do the same, manufacture the same output with a process that uses electricity instead of thermal hydrocarbons. That's what the energy transition is. Because if we can electrify the economy, we have a lot more different choices about how we generate that electricity. And that's how we can now start attacking environmental problems, whether it's CO2 emissions or particulate emissions or water degradation. That's where we can say what energy mix or what power generation mix is going to minimize that environmental footprint, but we're not giving up anything in terms of economic production because we've got a new process that will use electricity rather than hydrocarbons to produce the exact same process. Okay? Sounds really vague. Let me give you an example. Steel mills. We're trying to figure out how to take steel manufacturing from using large quantities of oil and gas and coal to fire furnaces and then throw metallurgical coal into that furnace with iron ore, and out on the back end comes steel. There's a few more processing steps in that. But now what the iron industry or what the steel industry is trying to do is say, how can I get from iron ore to steel without using natural gas as a fuel and without using metallurgical coal in the furnace with the iron ore? Okay, and there's a process out there. It's called DRI. And what it does is instead it uses electricity, and it takes the iron ore and it hits it with electricity, and it uses hydrogen as a catalyst. And now you get a different chemical reaction, but on the backside you get steel. Can we do it today? Well, on a laboratory basis, yeah. It's not commercial, but that's an example of what do we want? We want steel. How can we do it without using hydrocarbons? We can use electricity and hydrogen. So that's what we mean when we talk about that energy transition. We're not trying to get rid of the stuff we make with hydrocarbons today. We're trying to make the same stuff. We're just going to try and do it with a different process. And that process is going to be more electricity than it is hydrocarbons. This chart then says, well, as we're going on that decarbonization path, we're trying to de-risk that climate change chart. We are now going to take on 3 risks that we don't talk about. We talk about the climate change risk a lot, but what we don't talk about is where are those, you're still making stuff. Where does that stuff come from? How reliable is those locations where it comes from? And how much of that stuff exists? So what this chart shows you is that we often talk a lot about how concerned we are about OPEC. The oil-producing exporting countries, it's a cartel of about 20, it's anywhere between 15 and 20 countries depending on what week it is because members come in and out on a fairly regular basis. But we're worried about those countries collectively control about 30% of the world supply of oil, and the concern is they consciously and explicitly try to orchestrate their production in a way that results in a higher oil price than if they didn't coordinate. Right? So they're trying to manipulate or influence the market to a higher oil price. Now there's a lot of research that says, how effective are they at doing it? Well, there's a lot of research that kind of says it's mixed results. The reason why I point it out is we're concerned about an oil industry that has a cartel that stands up and actually, it isn't hiding in the shadows. OPEC stands up and says, we're a cartel. The oil industry is actually in a market concentration basis. The oil industry is actually less concentrated than the 3 primary minerals we need to make the energy transition work. To go from where we are today to electrifying the economy, we need copper, nickel, and cobalt. We need other stuff too. But those are the big 3 minerals that we need in order to electrify. the economy. Now, if you look at them, all of them, with the exception of copper, well, all of them are more concentrated, meaning that the top 10, these are the top, how much of the market does the top 10 producing countries have? So we've got a lot more copper supply and nickel and cobalt concentrated in the top 10 countries, top 10 producing countries, than we do in oil. So they're more concentrated, and with the exception of copper, they're less politically stable. So there's two risks on this page. One is we're increasing market concentration, so we are shifting market power towards the producer, which means it's going to, we increase the ability of those countries to influence the market price. And they tend to be countries that are less politically stable than the countries that produce oil today. Now, if you look at copper, it's a little more politically stable than oil, and that's because of Australia. If I took Australia out, copper drops down below nickel in terms of political stability. So there's two risks there. If you want to reduce the carbon footprint, if you want to mitigate that carbon emissions footprint, that risk, you're taking on market concentration risk, and you're also taking on political stability risk. So the likelihood that we could get supply disruptions increases, because as we move to the right and we move down, so as we move to that lower right-hand corner, the likelihood of supply disruptions increases. So we're taking on that risk. And oh, by the way, since we're getting off of hydrocarbons, not only have we increased the probability of supply disruptions, the impact of those supply disruptions get even bigger, because everybody's heading towards electricity as their primary source of energy in this pathway. The third risk that's on here is that second bullet point, is that if we go on a business as usual basis, so take out the energy transition for the next 50 years, for the next 30 years. If we just look at the demand for copper, nickel, and cobalt from 2000 to 2010, and we extend that trend out to 2050, we exhaust the known supply of copper, nickel, and cobalt before 2050. Now, there's something underneath that 2035. What it says is that's the existing mines today with a little bit brownfield expansions, kind of like in the oil industry. Brownfield expansions, and we add some technology that improves the yield out of the ore, out of the mine ore. That's where the 2035 goes. So it's the existing mines plus some enhancements. We run out of copper in 2035. So we need to do one of three things. Let's just look at copper for a second, because it's going to be true for the other two as well. We need to do one of three things. We need to either find, what's the most direct thing we can do? Well, with copper, the first choice thing that we could do is improve our recycling. We recycle less than 5% of the disposed copper in the world right now. We don't have to get it to 100%. If we could get it to 50%, if we could recycle 50% of the copper we dispose of every year in the planet, that would meet 1/2 of the copper demand from the energy transition. We still have another half to go. But if we could improve recycling, and a lot of that is, it's not the economics of recycling, because if we can get copper into a recycling place, we can recycle it. It's the cost of aggregating it and getting it to those recycling centers. We can figure out a way to do that more efficiently. There's an instantaneous supply of copper. And by the way, it's less energy intense than mining new copper, because it's already got all the rocks and impurities. It's just pure copper, and we just melt it down and reform it into some other use. So that would be a good thing. That's one thing we could do. Second thing we could do, in staying in the copper space, we could open new mines. We know where the mines are. We know where the copper resource is. We just have a difficulty in getting the mines opened, getting through the regulatory and the engineering process so that we can break earth and open the new mine. That process, we know of mines. When I was at BHP, there were projects we were looking at. There's a project in Arizona we've been trying to permit for 20 years. We're still going through the regulatory and permit, or they're going through, still going through the regulatory and permitting process. Once they get regulatory approval, it's another 10 years until that mine will produce first ore. And that's because a lot of mines, there's a lot of upfront costs. If it's greenfield, you got to build a lot of infrastructure, roads and power lines and that kind of stuff. And then the other thing you have to do with a lot of mines is you have to remove the overburden. And you have to take all the earth off and until you get down to the iron ore, and then start, or the copper ore, until you get down to the ore body and you start mining. And that takes time. It takes time to do that. So if you think about that mine in Arizona that BHP has been trying to get permit approval and then actually construct. We're sitting in 2023. They've had to restart the environmental permitting process in 2021. So that process still has another 3 years to run. So that's 2026. They still have more permitting to get done and engineering to get done. That's going to take them to 2030. And then it takes them 10 years till they get to first ore. We're looking at 2040. And that mine is the best copper prospect in the world. And we discovered it in the 1980s. And we've been struggling to get it online since then. We've got that issue across the energy industry. It is getting really hard to do. Any sort of project is getting increasingly hard to do. I'm not here saying we should just do away with all regulations. It's just the reality that not only does it take time to construct, but the time it takes to get the permission to construct is getting longer as well. I was talking to some folks from Cheyenne back in the fall, and they said they build LNG plants down on the Gulf Coast. And they said it now takes them longer to permit an LNG plant than it does to construct it. To give you an idea of how these project windows are getting elongated, and now think back to what we're going to try and do. We're going to try and pivot notionally 60% of the energy system today. We're going to pivot away from it in the next 30 years, but we're taking longer to approve each project that has to get done. And part of it goes back to a lot of those projects are getting not hung up, but they're being challenged by environmental issues that don't show up in that aren't showing up in the CO2 debate. So we've got to get this we've got to sort of figure out, and it goes back to we're not talking holistically about risks. So I don't know if the water quality issues in Arizona is a bigger environmental issue than reducing carbon emissions. But what I do know is there ought to be a discussion around that mine about what are we willing to trade off? Are we, is this, can we handle the water quality issues in a way that we can go after the carbon emission issues? Or is this just because the water quality issues are just so huge, there's just no way we can do this mine. And then we say, okay, well, we got to stop that idea. We got to move on to the next idea. So let's suppose we did solve all those upstream issues. We solved the mining and the processing. We've got enough carbon. We've got enough copper, cobalt, nickel at the mine mouth. Now we've got to move it into someplace because, copper comes out as a rock and it gets crushed and then it moves off to a smelter or to a processing plant. We still have to do some processing. What's happened, over the last 20 plus years is that the vast majority of that processing is concentrating in one geographic region, which is China. Now, this isn't saying that China shouldn't have it, but if 2022 in Europe taught us anything, it's the risk of being completely dependent on a critical supply to your economy from one jurisdiction. Diversification of a financial portfolio for your 401k, no financial advisor says, I think you ought to put it all in Bitcoin and let it ride. No, they tell you to diversify because they want you to be financially secure in 2050 when you're retired. Same thing in the energy system. We've got to diversify the risks. And one of the ways we diversify the risks is that we put different processing capacities in different parts of the world or different parts of a country. There is a bit of, on this risk, there is a bit of a recognition in the US in that the Energy and Infrastructure, I think the Energy Infrastructure Investment Act, which was passed in 2021, and the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, both have provisions that are designed to, with using tax credits, are designed to encourage the locating processing capacity for these critical minerals either in the US or in a friendly country. So the term you'll hear is reshoring, which means bringing that capacity to the US, or you'll hear the term friend-shoring. And friend-shoring is just, we're locating that capacity in some place that is, we're on better trade relationships, better diplomatic relationships with. We got a challenge in the current regulations, or in the current legislation, there's a bit of a challenge. I think it's going to be, we're going to have to adjust it, in that the way the IRA defines friend is a country that has a free trade agreement with the United States. The problem with that is we only have about 7 countries that we have free trade agreements with. And the 2 big ones are Mexico and Canada. Now, the reason why we do it, it's not that we don't like free trade. It's not that we don't want to trade with other countries, but starting in the 1970s, US trade policy pivoted away from bilateral relationships, country-to-country trading, to let's try to have trading systems that are more regional or global, under the belief that if I do a trade with you, if I do a free trade treaty with you, you and I are better off. But if I could get a trading arrangement with everybody at this table, you and I are better off over and above the way we would be unilaterally, because all these people would be benefiting as well. So it's not that we've got to think about, well, we've been on a policy path for 50 years of saying, let's expand the number of trading partners we have. And one of the consequences of that is we did fewer free trade agreements with bilateral countries. So I think we're going to have to go back and, the legislation is going to have to go back and redefine what a friend is, because we got to get that envelope bigger in order for this friend shoring, in order to get this diversification that we're seeking through that legislation. I think we're going to have to get a little bit, we're going to have to change a little bit of the verbiage of the regulation. Here's the, it's one of the nearing end charts. What this chart shows you is that the orange bars is the level of petroleum investment for the entire industry globally since 2018. And the bluish bar, which I think is actually cobalt, which is an unfortunate color to be using. But let's call it the cobalt bar, that's clean energy. That's global investment in clean energy. And that could be anything from solar, wind, nuclear, transmission lines for them. It's that whole bucket around the clean energy system. That's how much we've been investing. Now, the Financial Times reported just a couple of weeks ago that 2022 is a breakthrough year for the energy transition because it was the first time that clean energy invested more money globally than the oil and gas industry. And it's like, well, but for the prior 4 years, that statement's true. That's been going on for 4 years. Now, if we went backwards, and I'm going to try and get the data to update this chart, because you don't have to go back very far before the heights of those bars flip. So somewhere in the oil industry has been reducing the rate of investment since 2013. And then the oil price collapse in 2014 just exacerbated that decline. And clean energy investment started at a very nascent level, probably about 10 years ago, and then it was a hockey stick. But it's reached sort of a plateau, which is really kind of interesting, that it raced up to $1 trillion, and it's kind of plateaued there. It's still going up. You can't see it on this bar, but it's still creeping up a little bit every year, but it's really kind of plateaued out. I'm going to come back and talk about why in a second. The first thing I want to point out on this chart is that there's a misnomer out in the energy transition debate, that if the oil and gas companies would just stop investing in oil and gas and invest in clean energy, we would be on a pathway to net zero. The right bars say not quite, not so fast. Because if the oil and gas industry zeroed out oil and gas investment and it all went into clean energy, we'd go from $1 trillion of investment to $1.5 trillion of investment. But the IEA's Pathway to Net Zero study from 2020 says that clean energy investment needs to be $3.5 trillion every year for the next 30 years. So to give you an idea of how big is $3.5 trillion, it's roughly the US government budget every year. That's how much the world needs to be spending on clean energy. But the world's only spending $1 trillion in it. So if you think where we were in 2020, we are now about $13 trillion behind the net zero pathway that the IEA laid out in 2020. Now, there is a reason for that. And the reason is that why it's plateaued. And what's happening in the energy transition space is that we have money available to invest. We've got asset management companies sitting on about $1 trillion of investment that is dedicated to clean energy. And it's been sitting there since 2018. The reason why it's not being deployed is because it's getting harder and harder to find clean energy projects that earn a rate of return greater than the cost of capital for that investment. So give you an order of magnitude, what are these asset management firms facing? Their cost of capital is about 12%. And that it's 12% because they've promised the people who've put money into that fund, they've promised them a minimum of a 12% return. But the projects they're looking for in the clean energy space tend to have returns at around 6 to 8%. It's hard for them to, they can't make 6% investments on a 12% cost and be an asset management fund that's viable for very long, because every investment destroys destroys capital at a 6% rate per year. That's the quandary that they're in. And we're trying, what people are trying to figure out is how do you get those clean energy returns up so that we can start attracting more capital in to those industries. That's why it's plateaued. If we can figure out a way to get those returns higher, there is a source of capital, there is a demand for there are people who want to be in that space and are willing to provide capital if they can earn an effective, a sufficient rate of return. And that's what will jack it up. What we do know what's happening now is that what some companies are doing, Total is a great example of this. Total says their clean energy portfolio, which is largely solar and wind, has an average rate of return of 6 to 8%. And their hurdle rate is 10%. So the way they get to the 10% is they do two things. The 6 to 8%, and this is where it gets a little bit, I won't say complex, but there's a lot of moving parts here. The 6 to 8% is the project economics rate of return. So it means it's what happens at the site. It doesn't include any subsidies or tax credits. That's the 6 to 8%. Okay, what Total says is those tax credits, I consider those in my portfolio effect. So I've got assets that are at 6 to 8%. I want the portfolio to be at 10%. Part of the way I put the tax credits in, the 6% gets higher. The other thing that Total does is they go out and they look for partners to farm in. And they look for partners that are willing to pay a premium on the capital because they value that low carbon footprint. They value it more than the cost of than Total's cost of capital, and they're willing to pay that premium in order to participate in the project. The combination of using the tax credits and farming in entities willing to pay a premium is what gets them to the portfolio rate of 10%. And that's where they're at today. Now, in their earnings call a couple of weeks ago, Total said it's getting increasingly hard to find those counterparties willing to pay a premium. And I think the explanation is there's only so many people out there that are willing to pay that premium, and Total's kind of saturating that market. So they've often said part of the reason why they're going to slow down that energy transition is they've got to figure out they're not willing to yield on the 10%. So they're going to not stop, but they're going to slow down the way they grow that clean energy portfolio so they can figure out a way of how do we still meet that corporate requirement or our investor requirement for a 10% return on these 6% assets? And so there are people trying, it's not that people sit back and say, oh, can't make a 12% return, I'm not doing it. There is activity trying to figure out how do you get that to happen. My concern is that even if we could solve all that stuff, at $3.5 trillion a year for 30 years, or I guess going at 20 years, but at 30 years, you're notionally talking about $100 trillion. I'm not sure there's enough capital in the world to invest in that $100 trillion and enough capital for all the other things we need to invest in. Because remember, we got countries out there that are trying to get out of poverty, and the way you get out of poverty is by, you invest, not just in energy, but in other things. And I'm not sure that there's enough capital for everything we want to do over the next 30 years. And I don't know, and here's where this question is. I don't know how we solve it. I don't know how we solve all of those problems, because we're trying to solve each problem individually, and that's almost certainly going to give us a suboptimal solution to when we step back and look at all those issues holistically. The last chart that I want to show is that, so if you weren't convinced that there's an all of the above solution that we need in the energy transition, because the economics, because we got to figure out a way to make the economics work. Oh, by the way, let me go back one chart really quick and point out one last thing. Is if you look at that orange bar, the oil industry is on a pathway to net zero. Because the right-hand side bar says that they need to be investing just under $500 billion a year. On a pathway to net zero, the oil industry would need to invest about $500 billion a year, plus or minus a couple of billion. If you look at the last, and 2022 is no different, if you look at the last 5 years, the oil industry has been around $500 billion of investment. So one of the challenges of the energy transition is that part of the energy complex is on the pathway to net zero. That's the orange bars. Part of the energy complex is not on the pathway to zero, and that's the cobalt-colored bars. But if we don't get all of the energy system on the same pathway, it goes back to that, the energy crisis that we're seeing now, I expect, the risk is it's going to repeat itself. As the markets become imbalanced, another crisis emerges, we get that crisis, and there will be these crises. They'll just keep reappearing. There'll be different shapes and forms and sizes. But until the energy system gets on the pathway to net zero, assuming that that's what we want, if that's the policy pathway, if we don't get the whole system on it, you're going to see these disruptions repeat themselves over and over again, because the system can't stay in balance unless the entire system is on the same pathway. Okay, here's the last reason why I want to say all of the above work needs to be considered part of it. If you look at this chart, it kind of shows you of the big sources of energy potential in the world. You kind of look at their scattered around. We're looking at the hydrocarbons like gas, coal, and oil. We're looking at the low carbon stuff like uranium for nuclear power, hydro, solar, wind. If you notice, they are not evenly and uniformly distributed across the world. Different parts of the world have different energy endowments. So this kind of, if you look at Africa, you've got a big part of the middle of Africa that doesn't have those energy endowments. So it's tough to tell people in the middle of that continent, you need to do more solar or you need to do more wind, because they're like, wind doesn't blow here. How am I going to do wind? Yeah.
Sorry, you said that we could ask some questions.
Sure.
On the last slide, can you just, when it
Sure.
zero, you're talking about emissions?
It's that, so yeah, it's the thought that the combination of that, if you look at the carbon emissions that we have today and we abate them, or doing carbon capture, that the net effect of that is zero. Okay, so there will still be carbon emissions in 2050, but we're sequestering enough we're pulling it out of the atmosphere and putting it into the ground, so that on a net basis it's zero. So oil and gas, well, okay, I'm not going to be judgmental and say they're doing a good job. oil and gas are on the pathway. The clean energy sources are not. We've got that disconnect. Okay. Now, and this is going to be the other part of that clean energy, is that there are going to be parts of the world where clean energy investment isn't going to make any sense because they don't have the endowment. They don't have the rivers to build hydro. They don't have enough sun. They don't have the right length or intensity of the sun to do solar. They don't have the wind patterns to do wind. They're going to have to do, but Africa is still going to need energy. Right? Because if we want, I was talking to the class previous, if we want, not as an economist, but if we as society say eliminating poverty is a good thing and a robust growing global economy is a good thing because that's one of the ways that we alleviate poverty, we need Africa to emerge. We also need, India still has a pathway to follow, Latin America still has a pathway to follow, but they are farther down that economic poverty path road than Africa. If we want to eliminate poverty in the world, Africa is the continent of this century where Africa has to emerge. But now you look at their resource abundant, and they aren't really abundant in a lot of energy sources. So how is Africa going to emerge if we need to reduce energy poverty to reduce their economic poverty? We're going to have to move energy we're going to have to produce it someplace else and move it to Africa for consumption. The problem that we have with wind, solar, and hydro is that energy isn't mobile. It gets produced locally and it gets consumed locally. So part of the energy transition is going to have to be figuring out how do we generate energy that can be consumed locally. How can we do places where they're consuming mobile energy, which is call it oil and gas, and how do we get them to substitute for a locally produced energy like wind or solar, which frees up oil and gas that we could move to those parts of the world that need to emerge from poverty. That's got to be part of the solution, because if we're going to get on the pathway to net zero, we got to figure that out as well. We've got to figure out we've got a lot of stuff we need to figure out. So this comes back to I don't know the answers, but if you guys figure out an answer, all I ask for is 1%. So I'm going to stop there and say, do we have any more questions or comments or?
Yep. I think we're just about out of time, so I want to make sure everyone has the chance, if they need to leave, to do so. And before they do, to thank you. So please join me in thanking our speaker. Thank you so much. And here's this.
Thanks.
And can you guys stick around for a minute? Because I think if people have questions, Teddy.
Yeah, I think she's planning questions from 1 to 2.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah. So you are going to stick around. So there are questions from 1 to 2. So you folks are welcome to hang out and.
Yeah, but I'm only answering questions from students from 1 to 2.
Okay. Sorry. So if you're out of luck, if you're faculty or community member or staff, so sorry about that. But thank you all so much for being here. Take care.